and February, and I will try not to repeat any of the information that I shared with you then.
That's all
But I
right.
do have some additional information for you. And I never learned how to be brief, so I'm gonna talk fast.
Yeah.
And then save some time for any Q&A or clarifications that you might have at the end. And I wanna tell you what I'm gonna talk about. I'm gonna talk about Michael.
Do you mind if I record you?
Not at all, not at all, be my guest. Everything is, Jack Webb said, nothing but the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And I want to say hello to my fellow peaceful warriors and prayer warriors in the blue shirts, the St. Peter Claver Social Justice Committee. I miss you guys. I'm going to begin by talking about Michael Luther King, and that is not an error, and I'm going to explain why. I am then going to talk about the slaveholding founders of the United States of America in Congress, in the White House, and on the Supreme Court, because we're in the midst of this fervor about critical race theory, which is a graduate school course in law school. Believe me, it is not taught in kindergarten and first grade, as some would have us believe. And I want to read a couple of short pieces. One is from, in their own words, A History of the American Negro, Slave Narratives, published in 1964, one of a 3-volume set by Milton Meltzer, just contains so much fascinating information. This is where I learned what hoe cakes were. Okay, the slaves used to take and put flour, sort of like pancakes, or like, what do they call them, honey? My wife of 53 years knows all of this information. And they would put them on a hoe and put it in the fireplace.
Hoe cakes.
And they were called hoe cakes. And in Hollywood Shuffle, one of the characters said, even hoes need a place to sleep. The other document that I'm going to read from is 12 Million Black Voices, which was written by Richard Wright in 1941,
Oh, for heaven's sake.
at which point there were 12 million Negroes in the United States, and 2 short excerpts, one on the meaning of the word Negro, and then 2 on black families. Since Father Gifford writes to the Claver family, I thought it would be appropriate to include information about the black family. So those are just very short readings, a couple of paragraphs. I also then want to talk about the early presence of African Americans in Minnesota, including the Buffalo Soldiers, who were stationed at Fort Snelling, that a lot of people may not be aware of. And how many of you have ever heard of drapetomania? Okay, you're about to. It was a rare disease that caused Negroes to run away. And, more about that a bit later. Then I want to talk more specifically
I've heard of it, but
about Frederick Lamar McGee, who along with Samuel Hardy were the 2 founders of St. Peter Claver Church. A bit about Archbishop John Ireland, who served mass to slaves during the Civil War, and who, upon the establishment of St. Peter Claver, because African American Catholics were not always welcome in white Catholic churches, said that he was going to serve mass here until they could find a black priest. And Father Stephen Theobald's picture is on the landing in this stairway. It was the first African American priest west of Chicago. And he and Archbishop John Ireland actually went to Montreal, Canada, and recruited Stephen Theobald, but Stephen has a very rich background. I want to talk a bit about the history of the NAACP, since Fred McGee established first the Twin Cities chapter of the NAACP in 1911. He died regrettably in 1912, and in 1913 the St. Paul NAACP was founded in his memory. Du Bois, as I shall point out, credited Fred McGee with being the founder of the Niagara Movement. Some of you have heard of the Niagara Movement?
Yeah.
And I want to talk about a couple of the players in the Niagara Movement. And I will give my presentation to Madam Evelyn upon its completion. And there are a number of pictures in here. Evelyn and I were unable to communicate yesterday. I wanted to see if I could bring my jump drive and you could see the pictures during the presentation. So without any further ado, let me put on my wife's reading glasses since I left mine in the car. Thank you, darling. And open with a quote from Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who was the father of Black history. And I talked about Carter G. Woodson and the founding of Black history last year. I'm not going to do that again this year. So if you want to learn more about him, ask Evelyn to share my presentation from last year with you. In The Miseducation of the Negro, Carter G. Woodson said that if you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. When you determine what a man shall think, you do not have to concern yourself about what he will do. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. If you make a man think that he is justly an outcast, you do not have to order him to the back door. He will go without being told. And in fact, if there is no back door, his very nature will demand one, and he will cut one for his own special benefit. Okay. We are marking today and tomorrow the birthday of Martin Luther King, which was one of my assigned topics. Well, Evelyn is a real taskmaster. I'm telling you, she gave me about 15 things that I'm supposed to cover this morning. So hence I will talk fast, having never learned how to be brief. As we observe the birthday and the anniversary of Dr. King's birth, I'd like to share some personal reflections with you on what I believe is the deeper meaning of Dr. King's life and our national holiday. During the last and the next few days, we'll hear lots of sanitized information about Dr. King, and you might easily think that during his entire life he gave only one speech, only one paragraph long about a dream, and then he was shot and died in Memphis, Tennessee. End of story.
Oh.
Yeah, pretty much.
Not quite, okay? Michael Luther King was his christened name. He was born January 15th, 1929, and he did not have his name formally changed to Martin Jr. until the age of 6. He grew up in a home where his father, the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., and his grandfather were both Baptist ministers, Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, where Raphael Warnock, the incumbent re-elected senator from Georgia, is the current senior pastor. His mother, Alberta Williams King, any relation?
No, not
None that we're aware of. Was
common
a school
name.
teacher. This brother here was a cancer researcher at the University of Minnesota and a member of the board of directors of the Hill Family Foundation, which became the Northwest Area Foundation. And as the only black staff member, I was a senior program officer, and I can't tell you how rewarding it was to go in that boardroom and see this black face sitting across the table when I was trying to give away $18 million of Mr. Hill's money every other month. So, brother, thank you again. Okay.
Thank you.
Appreciate that support. Okay. Alberta Williams King was a school teacher, a piano teacher, and part of the elite middle-class black Atlanta. And it served as effective insulation, separating young Martin from the forces of racial segregation that otherwise might have significantly limited his development. In the Negro Atlanta in which Dr. King grew up, social structure was rigidly defined by color, money, and profession. Don't get me wrong, the black professional and financial status of Atlanta gave it one of the most substantial black middle classes anywhere in America. After all, it was the black middle class there and here who could afford the luxury of being in the forefront of the civil rights movement. They could take time off from work to attend and lobby at city council meetings in the state legislature, not unlike today. It was the black middle class that was respected by the white ruling class, and who, although their goals may be considered moderate by today's standards, set the wheels of progress in motion that began the second civil rights movement in our nation's history, the Reconstruction era immediately following the Civil War, which lasted for 12 years, being the first. Growing up in this middle-class black family, young Martin had little time for anything other than his studies in church. Yep, he was a shy little nerd. In grade school, young Martin was not an extraordinary student, but because of the shortage of young black men entering Negro colleges during World War II, Martin was allowed to take his college entrance exam as a 14-year-old junior at Booker T. Washington High School and skipped the 12th grade, where in 1945, at the age of 15, he was allowed to enter and matriculate at Morehouse College in Atlanta. And during the next 4 years, he would be ordained as a Baptist minister, become an assistant to his father at Ebenezer, and graduate from Morehouse College with a degree in sociology. In 1948, after graduating from college at the age of 19, he entered Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, where he earned a Bachelor of Divinity or Religious Studies degree. It should also be pointed out that he fell in love with the white groundskeeper's daughter and created quite a scandal during his stay at Crozier. Okay, Dr. King did have an eye for pretty women. Okay, he graduated with honors as the outstanding student in his class and obtained his PhD in systematic theology. Brother Gifford, you're going to have to explain that one to us at some point when it's convenient. From Boston University in 1955. Now, while at Boston, young Martin met Coretta Scott of Herberger, Alabama. That's a familiar name, given that the heirs had a department store right up the street a couple blocks.
Yeah.
Okay. Young Coretta Scott was studying classical music and voice at the New England Conservatory of Music and came from a similar middle class, some would say bourgeois family as Dr. King. They would marry, and 1 year later, with an infant child at the tender age of 25, Martin would be called to serve his first full-time church leadership position as pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And Sister Evelyn and I want to thank you and the other people who contributed several years ago when we took several dozen students to Montgomery and Selma, Alabama on a civil rights tour. And we stayed one block from Dr. King's church, and we also from Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, his first calling. And our group had the opportunity to go in there, and it is literally one block from the Alabama State Capitol, okay? Now, let me point out that this young 25-year-old father and first-time minister did not go to Montgomery, Alabama with the intention of starting a civil rights movement, as some would have us believe. His background alone, along with that of his wife, should help to point out how extraordinary the circumstances of history can be. As C. Eric Lincoln points out, Martin Luther King Jr. was thrust into a leadership position under the most curious circumstances imaginable. If he could have chosen the time, it would not have been soon after he and Coretta were married and had begun a family, or so early in his first-time ministerial position. If he could have chosen the issue, it would not have been one which required black people, who were already tired from segregated jobs, to walk for over a year. And if he could have chosen the place, it would hardly have been the cradle of the Confederacy, just one block from the Alabama State Capitol, where Jefferson Davis took the oath of President of the Confederate States of America. But history seldom inquires whether or not we will play the game. As pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, Dr. King inherited a congregation of college professors, black professionals, and the leadership of the Montgomery Improvement Association. Clearly, a middle-class, some would say bourgeois, congregation, okay? Now, it was in this latter organization that a retired railroad porter named Edward Daniel Nixon, thank you, darling, belonged. He, if anything, ED, as he liked to be called, no relation to Richard Nixon, that's a big E.D. Nixon deserves some credit himself for having started the civil rights movement. There were three causes of the civil rights movement. The first was the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, which led to the establishment of the Citizens Council, the Libertarian Party, the John Birch Party, the reemergence of the Ku Klux Klan. And that was number one. Number two was the murder of Emmett Till, which resulted in rallies, anti-lynching rallies all over the country, including Minneapolis, where the keynote speakers were Thurgood Marshall, Roy Wilkins, and Mamie Till Mobley, okay? And that was basically how the NAACP gained a foothold in the civil rights movement, because much of the money that was raised at those rallies after the murder of Emmett Till went into the till of the National NAACP and helped them establish more than 2,200 chapters around the country, okay? On December 5th, 1955, the third cause of the civil rights movement, a seamstress named Rosa Parks, who happened to be Mr. E.D. Nixon's secretary in the Montgomery NAACP, and who had recently graduated from the Highlander Folk School, taking courses in African American history and community organizing, refused to give up her seat. And would anybody like to tell me what Rosa Parks was thinking about on that bus in Montgomery when she refused to give up her seat?
Her feet hurt. She was tired.
She was thinking about the murder of Emmett Till, which had occurred 3 weeks prior, and Mamie Mobley Till, who said, "We need to make certain that my son didn't die for nothing." Okay? So the Brown v. Board of Education decision, the murder of Emmett Till, and then Rosa Parks thinking about Emmett Till, who said, when the bus driver said, "Lady, you got to give up that seat," she said, "Listen, I expect I paid the same fare for this seat as the white man. And when I get to my stop, he can gladly have my seat and not a stop before," okay? After which she was arrested, the third black woman arrested in Montgomery for refusing to give up her seat on the bus. Unfortunately, at first was a 15-year-old girl who was pregnant, who they said could teach drunk sailors some new curse words. And the second was what was politely referred to as a lady of the night, whose feet were also tired. And, the ministers and the Montgomery Improvement Association did not think it would be appropriate to advocate on behalf of the first two sisters, but Rosa Parks was an angel sent from heaven, okay? And so when E.D. Nixon's secretary was arrested, okay, he spread the word to 100 active citizens in Montgomery's black community. He was also the head of the retired Pullman Porters in Alabama, so many of them were also called, and encouraged 100 of them and insisted that they attend a meeting early that evening at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. However, in his excitement, E.D. had neglected to seek the permission or to inform the new minister, okay? When he phoned Dr. King late that afternoon.
That never happens at Flavor.
About 45 minutes before the meeting, okay, and inquired whether he would mind the meeting being held in the church basement in an hour. Martin was reluctant, to say the least, because his wife Coretta was making one of her special honey-dipped southern fried chicken dinners. He could smell the aroma coming out of the kitchen, and the boy was hungry. So Dr. King asked E.D. Nixon, what would happen if I said no to having a meeting in the church basement? And he was informed by Nixon that he would have to do some powerful explaining, and quickly, to the 100 or so people who had already made plans to attend. So I said that he entered the civil rights movement reluctantly. Dr. King missed dinner and went to the meeting that evening, where the group decided they needed a spokesperson for the Montgomery Improvement Association, someone who could speak the language of the white Montgomery City Council, which was also the transit authority. Remember, they were organizing a bus boycott, okay? Somebody who could speak on their level. Someone the powerful white folks could not intimidate or whose job they could not threaten. They also needed someone for this dangerous assignment who was expendable, and in short, who else other than a brand new minister who had just come to town? Besides, he had one of them D things behind his name, okay, and they figured that would give him some credibility. He was drafted by his soon-to-become good friend Ralph Abernathy, another minister in Montgomery, who, lo and behold, was unwilling to assume the leadership role himself. Kicking and screaming. This is how Martin Luther King entered the civil rights movement, okay? And there was nothing in his philosophical or religious textbooks that applied to the situation or would prepare him for what he was about to be thrust into in Montgomery, Alabama. As it turns out, King made an excellent, if unwilling, and challenging choice. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days, more than a year, days of walking, carpooling, and legal battles before it was won. Not only were black people allowed to sit anywhere they wanted on the buses, which is a common misconception, but black drivers, mechanics, secretaries, and support staff were hired by the company as part of the settlement. Now, this is what they call the old folks civil rights movement, okay? And vastly misunderstood. In winning the case and attracting the attention of the world and launching the second civil rights movement, Dr. King also made two additional contributions of significance. First, he introduced into American history and lexicon the concept of peaceful nonviolence, and second, he made a giant step in liberating black men from the shadow of white leadership and black inferiority, because the spokespersons for anything that black people wanted to do in the mid-1950s were white men, okay? White men in power. As C. Eric Lincoln points out in Montgomery, black people learned to talk together, pray together, walk together, and stay together. Having learned how to do that, the ensuing course of events was predictable. No chains can hold a people who believe in themselves and in each other. The following year, Dr. King helped start and was elected president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or SCLC, which coordinated civil rights demonstrations throughout the South. And if somebody would like to learn more about Dr. King's relationship with a fishnet pantyhose wearing rascal named J. Edgar Hoover, please bring it up during the Q&A session. I'd be happy to bring you up to speed, okay? Number two, the slaveholding founders of the United States of America. I think with CRT, they're trying to eliminate any reference to racial inequality, to slavery, to black authors like Toni Morrison, like who was the sister with the lovely gray hair that said, "And still I rise"?
Maya Angelou.
Maya Angelou. You know, I mean, they just want to rid the history books of anything that might make somebody feel uncomfortable, okay? The first enslaved person of record in the United States was a female, later renamed Angela, who was among the first 20 Africans that arrived in 1619. What was the name of the boat? On the good ship Jesus, okay? At the mouth of the James River in Jamestown, Virginia, okay? And she would be the first mark of the subjugation of millions of African Americans to follow. Now, this was 170 years before the first Congress of the United States was ever convened, okay? 1619. For the first 30 years of American lawmaking, from 1789 to 1819, more than half of the men elected to Congress in each session were slaveholders, okay? 18 of the first 30 Supreme Court justices also owned slaves. In total, more than 1,800 members of Congress had been slaveholders, and some continued to serve in Congress well into the 1920s. The first woman elected to the United States Senate was a former slaveholder, okay? Slavery was abolished in 1863. At the time, 7 of the 9 Supreme Court justices were at one time slave owners, okay? In the history of the Supreme Court up to that time, an estimated 27 judges were believed to have owned slaves. Don't take my word for it. Look at the October 22nd, 2022 Washington Post article, which pointed out that more than 1,865 congressmen once enslaved black people. This is who they were and how they shaped our nation, okay? And we live with the policies and laws which they enacted and put on the books to this day. Now, a lot of people, well, no, before I do that, let me go into, in their own words, okay? Because I promised to tell you all a little bit about drapetomania.
Excuse me, is that still in print?
You might be able to find it on Amazon used, okay?
Thank you.
In their own words, A History of the American Negro. It's one of 3 volumes edited by Milton Meltzer, and this was published in 1964. It says in the front page it belonged to Charles Anderson III, whoever he was.
Charles Anderson III.
That used to be my slave name, okay, for those of you who are newcomers. Slave owners whose property disappeared in the night went to great trouble to track down the fugitives. A healthy slave was worth a good deal of money, and his or her loss was painful. Thousands of men and women, usually young, fled annually, and no greater proof of how much bondage was hated could be offered. But nevertheless, Dr. Samuel Cartwright of the University of Louisiana published his theory that there was a disease peculiar to Negroes called drapetomania, the disease causing Negroes to run away. He secured tens of thousands of dollars from plantation owners to try and come up with an antidote to this disease that only affected Negroes. Well, it must have been a powerful infection, for it overcame all of the remedies concocted to prevent it, okay? One of the diseased slaves was a man whose name was Jordan Anderson, no relationship. And his former master was Colonel P.H. Anderson, again, no relation, from Big Spring, Tennessee. And when the war ended, the South was a wreck. Its cities were shelled and burned, its fields and crops ruined, its men dead or wounded. The freed slaves wandered over the land, desperately trying to survive without the help of masters upon whom they had depended all of their lives. Food for the table, a roof overhead, education for the children, care for the old folks, work jobs. Where would it come from in a desolate and bitter South? Thousands and thousands of Negroes had left their old places, sometimes because they wanted something better, something else, whatever it might be. Sometimes because no one was left to take over things, other times because old masters had returned and driven them off. One ex-slaveholder, typical of many, tried to get back a former slave who had slipped away to freedom during the war. And here is the freedman's reply. To my old master, Colonel P.H. Anderson, Big Spring, Tennessee. Sir, I got your letter. I was glad to find that you had not forgotten Jordan and that you wanted me to come back and live with you again, promising to do better for me than anybody else can. I have often felt uneasy about you and thought the Yankees would have hung you long before this for harboring rebels they found in your barn. I suppose they never heard about your going to Colonel Martin's to kill a Union soldier that was left by his company in their stable. Although you shot at me twice before I left you, I did not want to hear of your being hurt, and I'm glad you're still living. It would do me good to go back to the dear old home again and see Miss Mary and Miss Martha and Mr. Stanley and Alan, okay? Esther, Green, and Lee. Give my love to all of them and tell them I hope we will meet in the better world, if not in this. I would have gone back to see you when I was working in the Nashville hospital, but one of the neighbors told me that Henry intended to shoot me if he ever got the chance. I want to know particularly what the good chance is that you propose to give me. I'm doing tolerably well here. I get $25 a month with victuals and clothing, have a comfortable home for Mandy, the folks call her Mrs. Anderson, and the children, Millie, Jane, and Grundy, go to school and are learning well. The teacher says that Grundy has a head for a preacher. They go to Sunday school, and Mandy and me attend church regularly. We are kindly treated. Sometimes we overhear others saying, them colored people were slaves down in Tennessee. The children feel hurt when they hear such remarks, but I tell them it was no disgrace in Tennessee to belong to Colonel Anderson. Many darkies would have been proud, as I used to be, to call you massa. Now, if you will write and say what wages you will give me, I will be better able to decide whether it would be to my advantage. As to my freedom, which you say I can have, there's nothing to be gained on that score, as I got my free papers in 1864 from the Provost Marshal General of the Department of Nashville. Mandy says she would be afraid to go back without some proof that you were disposed to treat us justly and kindly. And we have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time that we served.
That's great.
This will make us forget and forgive old scores and rely on your justice and friendship in the future. I served you faithfully for 32 years and Mandy 20 at $25 a month for me and $2 a week for Mandy. Our earnings amount to $11,680. Add to this the interest for the time our wages have been kept back, and deduct what you paid for our clothing, 3 doctor's visits for me, and pulling a tooth for Mandy, and the balance will show what we are in justice entitled to. Please send the money by Adams Express in care of V. Winters, Esquire, Dayton, Ohio. If you fail to pay us for faithful labors in the past, we can have little faith in your promises in the future. We trust the good Maker has opened your eyes to the wrongs which you and your fathers have done to me and my fathers, in making us toil for you for generations without recompense. Here, I draw my wages every Saturday night, but in Tennessee, there was never any payday for the Negroes any more than for the horses and cows. Surely, there will be a day of reckoning for those who defraud the laborer of his hire. In answering this letter, please state if there would be any safety for my Millie and Jane, who are now grown up and both beautiful looking girls. You know how it was with poor Matilda and Catherine. I would rather stay here and starve and die, if it come to that, than have my girls brought to shame by the violence and wickedness of your young masters. You will also please state if there have been any good schools opened for the colored children in your neighborhood. The great desire of my life now is to give my children an education and have them form virtuous habits. Say howdy to George Carter and thank him for taking the pistol out of your hands when you were shooting at me. From your old servant, Jordan Anderson. Beautiful. Isn't that incredible? We are a resilient people, okay? And as proof of that, as proof of the pain that we have inherited through slavery, I want to tell my personal story, okay? My baptismal certificate from St. Peter Claver Church says that I and both of my parents were colored, okay? My birth certificate says I'm colored. My baptismal certificate says I'm a Negro, okay? My diploma from St. Peter Claver in the 8th grade says I'm black. My diploma from Central High School says I'm Afro-American with a hyphen, okay? My first degree says that I'm an African-American without the hyphen, and my passport says I'm American. So if I'm a little schizophrenic, you know, that I come by that honestly, okay? And what I want to do is go to Richard Wright from 1941 because I reoriginally was going to call my presentation, What's in a Name? And Richard Wright says, this is from 12 Million Black Voices. The word Negro, the term by which orally or in print we black folk in the United States are usually designated, is not really a name at all, nor a description, but a psychological island whose objective form is the most unanimous fiat in all of American history, America's original sin. A fiat buttressed by popular and national tradition and written down in many state and city statutes. A fiat which artificially and arbitrarily defines, regulates, and limits in scope of meaning the vital contours of our lives and the lives of our children and our children's children. This island, within whose confines we live, is anchored in the feelings of millions of people and is situated in the midst of the sea of white faces we meet each day. And by and large, as 300 years of time has borne our nation into the 20th century, remember this is 1941, its rocky boundaries have remained unyielding to the waves of our hope that dash against it. The steep cliffs of this island are manifest on the whole in the conduct of whites toward us hour by hour, a conduct which tells us that we possess no rights commanding respect, the Dred Scott decision, and that we have no claim to pursue happiness in our own fashion, that our progress toward civilization constitutes an insult, that our behavior must be kept firmly within an orbit branded as inferior, that we must be compelled to labor at the behest of others, that as a group we are owned by the whites, and that manliness on our part warrants instant reprisal. 300 years are a long time for millions of folk like us to be held in such subjugation. So long a time that perhaps scores of years will have to pass before we shall be able to express what this slavery has done to us. For our personalities are still numb from its long shocks, and as the numbness leaves our souls, we shall yet have to feel and give utterance to the full pain that we shall inherit. Next, Wright talks about the black family. Living by folk tradition, possessing but a few rights which others respect, we are unable to establish our family groups upon a basis of property ownership. For the most part, our delicate families are held together by love, sympathy, pity, and the goading knowledge that we must work together to make a crop. That is why we black folks laugh and sing when we are alone together. There is nothing, no ownership or lust for power that stands between us and our kin. And we reckon kin not as others do, but down to the 9th and 10th cousin. And for a reason we cannot explain, we are mighty proud when we meet a man, woman, or child who, in talking to us, reveals that the blood of our blood has somehow entered their veins. Because our eyes are not blinded by the hunger for possessions, we are a tolerant folk. A black mother who stands in the sagging door of her gingerbread shack may weep as she sees her children straying off into the unknown world. But no matter what they do, no matter what happens to them, no matter what crimes they may commit, no matter what the world may think of them, that mother always welcomes them back with an irreducibly human feeling that stands above the claims of law or property. Our scale of values differs from that of the world from which we have been excluded. Our shame is not its shame, and our love is not its love. From 12 Million Black Voices by Richard Wright. Just, isn't that powerful?
Yes, beautiful.
Wonderful.
And they want to ban these books because they might make somebody feel uncomfortable. So better get them in the library, pick them up on Amazon fast. Now, a lot of people are quick to say, a lot of white people in particular, some of my best friends are white people.
Some of my
And
relatives.
they
are
tell
white.
me, I never owned any slaves. My family didn't own any slaves, so let's keep moving, Yusef. I mean, enough of this slavery business. But it is,
I have some relatives like that too.
yeah, I believe it. It is important that we tell the truth about the real history of our country back to the beginning and why it matters and what it tells us about where we are in this present moment. Do you know that the 1980 census, there were 18 million indigenous Native Americans when Columbus thought he had sailed to the western part of India. That's why we call people from the Caribbean West Indians,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
And he said, y'all don't even know who you are. You must be West Indians, okay? The 1980 census was the first time in over 100 years that the population of the indigenous population of Native Americans in this country exceeded 1 million persons, okay? And we can talk about what happened in Nazi Germany. We can talk about what King Leopold did in the Belgian Congo, killed enough people to stack the bodies arm in arm from New York to San Francisco. But this is right here on the ground that we inherit today, okay? Why does it matter, and what does it tell us about where we're at in this present moment? The evidence is too thoroughly documented to debate. Take voting rights and voter suppression, the vast racial wealth, education, health, housing, criminal justice gaps, and the disproportionate impact of violence on people of color. These are glaring examples of current day struggles and pains that stem directly from the history of slavery in our country. And Isabel Wilkerson wrote two very beautiful books that I would recommend. The first is called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is a takeoff on the ending paragraph in Richard Wright's Black Boy, which ended in Natchez, Mississippi, where he said, "I'm going to take and plant my soul in the warmth of other suns."
I
Okay?
didn't remember that.
She said in her second book called Caste, very powerful, and I could give you a lecture just about some of the things that she uncovered in her research. Absolutely incredible. The comparisons to Nazi Germany, who came to the United States, Johannesburg, South Africa, and Australia, and said, hey, no more tickets. The Americans have got this stuff down pat. We are going to practice against the Jews what they have done against black people for the past 300 years. These people ain't playing. They're kicking butt, taking names. Okay, and the genocide against Jewish people in Nazi Germany was based on the subjugation of African Americans in the United States. Read the book. Caste. Don't take my
It
word
was
for it.
just on TV the other day. Same
Well,
thing.
the presence of black people in this area goes all the way back to the 1780s when Jean Bonga was apprenticed by his parents to French-speaking trappers and fur traders who had settled in the Arrowhead region, the northeast corner of the state of Minnesota. And he would marry an Ojibwe woman, give birth to two sons, George Bonga and Stephen Bonga. And there's a township in Cass County called Bongo County to this day, named after him. The Indian side of the family go by the name Bongo. The black side of the family go by the name Bonga. And Jean Fountain was one of his direct descendants, and her son founded television station 41. I don't know what the call letters are, but it started in St. Cloud. And we need to look, pardon me, Dred Scott and Harriet Robinson both lived at Fort Snelling in the 1830s as enslaved persons. They were there for the 17 years that Dred Scott's case, coming from Missouri, a slave state, to Minnesota, a free state, and seeking his freedom. The Supreme Court, Justice Taney, who had a law practice and roomed with Francis Scott Keyes, who wrote the Star Spangled Banner. If you look at the original stanzas, there are several that relate to slavery, and are not very positive toward.
And they're not. Yeah, they're not.
Clearly
They're not in print very often anymore.
I think CRT is going to try and put them in the closet too. Okay. The Dred Scott decision handed down by the Supreme Court after 17 years said, the Negro possesses no rights that the white man is bound to respect.
That's right. Yeah.
And that was law for decades. The 1850 census recorded 39 persons of African descent in Minnesota. By 1860, there were 259 black residents in the state. And in 1861, Minnesota was the first state to commit troops to Abraham Lincoln to fight in the Civil War to return down south to free the slaves. 104 of the 259 black men, women, and children in Minnesota at the time the Civil War broke out joined up to fight with the Union Army. Okay, almost half, more than half of the adult black population. On May 15th, 1863, 218 former Missouri slaves, including 100 women and children, traveled up the Mississippi to Minnesota on a paddle wheeler named the Davenport. And upon their arrival at Lambert's Landing on Jackson and whatever they call Mississippi River Road downtown, were met by Irish levee workers who stoned the riverboat for fear that these contraband Negroes were going to take their jobs. So the captain made a U-turn in the Mississippi River and went back down to Hastings, where after dark, he put a plank over the side and escorted them Negroes off of his boat. And they had to walk through the swamp and up the trail in the dark. That's why they started Pilgrim Baptist Church. And they considered themselves pilgrims because of the way they had to enter. There was a contraband Negro by the name of Robert T. Hickman, no relation to the Hickman family, who became the first pastor of Pilgrim Baptist Church in 1866. Now, that was the second black church in the state of Minnesota. The first was St. James A&E, not the one on Dale and Central, but the one on 3600 Snelling Avenue in South Minneapolis. Snelling is the street between Hiawatha and Minnehaha. And St. James is still there, the oldest black congregation in the state of Minnesota. Okay? So, lot of history. Okay? The 25th Infantry of the Buffalo Soldiers was stationed at Fort Snelling. They served from 1866 to 1957, seeing action in the American Indian Wars, the Spanish-American War, the Philippine-American War, and in World War II. Okay? And a lot of people think that the Buffalo Soldiers were just out west fighting the Indians. They were stationed at the 25th Infantry of the Buffalo Soldiers was stationed at Fort Snelling. Now, let me get to Fred Mgeni and Stephen Theobald. This is the picture of the Niagara movement, okay? 29 black men went to Buffalo, New York, and there were two leaders at that point in history, 1905. There were the Bookerites, who followed Booker T. Washington, and there were the people who followed W.B. Du Bois. Fred Mgeni, who along with Samuel Hardy was one of the two founders of St. Peter Claver Church, was aggressively sought after and recruited by both Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. Fred decided to go with Du Bois, okay? And Du Bois would come to the program they held in Fred's memoriam in 1912 following his death at Halleck-U Brown. And the William Monroe Trotter, there were all the black intellectuals, political figures, elected and appointed officials, came to St. Paul for the memorial program they had in tribute of Fred Mgeni, okay? Now, in this picture, Fred has a 7-year-old boy sitting in his lap. That 7-year-old boy is Norris, check the middle name, Bumstead Herndon. Okay, I didn't think anybody except Dagwood was named Bumstead. Norris Bumstead Herman, okay, was seated in Fred Mgenie's lap in this picture, okay, and again, I'll leave this afterwards. And his reality was that Norris struggled with his sexual identity, and although he had hoped to become an artist, he graduated from Harvard Business School in the early 1920s, the only black person in his class, and became the president at age 28 of his father's Atlanta insurance company. His father was Alonzo Herndon. And when Sherman had his march to the sea, he burnt down all the wooden buildings in Atlanta. All the brick buildings were built by blacks, by former slaves who were tradesmen, okay? And Alonzo Herndon's mansion was a brick building. It still exists today. And if you ever go to Atlanta and take the Black Atlanta tour, you get a chance to go by his house. I took it, and in the living room is a huge picture, 15 feet long, of the Niagara movement with Norris Bumstead sitting in Fred's lap. And the tour guide said, "Now that's Norris Bumstead. We don't know who that fella is, whose lap he's sitting in." I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, that's Frederick Lamar Mgeni." Okay? And he was the first African-American attorney in the state of Minnesota and 2 other states. He founded St. Peter Claver Church with Samuel Hardy, and he was the first African-American lawyer admitted to practice law before the Minnesota Supreme Court. So you need to know who's left. Norris Bumstead. I don't want to come back here and have you say you don't know who that he's with. His father died when he was 28 years old, and he became the president of his father's insurance company. He started Penny Insurance Companies. He was one of the first black millionaires in the United States. And he built the assets of the company up to $84 million. He was an incredible philanthropist. He gave money, he created the Atlanta University Complex, which is 8 historically black universities in the city of Atlanta. He gave money to the NAACP, to the Urban League, to the Niagara movement, to all kinds of black causes. He devoted land. He built and paid for the stadium at Clark University in Atlanta. And the Niagara movement was funded by, what was Carnegie's first name?
Andrew.
Andrew Carnegie and Alonzo Herndon. Okay, they were the two people that funded the Niagara movement. The Niagara movement was established in 1905, okay? And it's important because along with W.E.B. Du Bois, William Monroe Trotter, Fred McGee, and Charles Edwin Bentley of Chicago, the need was recognized for a national activist group. And they organized this conference July 11th to 13th, 1905 in Buffalo, New York. But they didn't want any of the Bookerites to learn about their attempts to create this national civil rights organization. So they got on a tourist boat, went across Niagara Falls, and they held the first meeting of the Niagara movement at the Erie Beach Hotel in Fort Erie, Ontario, Canada, across the Niagara River from Buffalo, New York. And they called it the Niagara movement because they wanted it to symbolize the strong current of a river. And state chapters would advance local agendas and disseminate information about the organization and its goals in 17 states. Guess who was elected the secretary for the state of Minnesota? Frederick Lamar McGee. Okay? The Niagara movement laid the cornerstone of the modern civil rights era, and the new movement found a voice. The organization continued until 1911, when almost all of its members became the backbone of the newly formed National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I've only got 2 or 3 pages left, and a lot of them have pictures on them. So
All right, keep going.
if you need to get a glass of water or use the restroom, feel free to do that. John Coltrane played a solo one time with Miles Davis, and Miles had real bad back problems. And he said, "Coltrane, how come you played so long?" And Coltrane said, "I'm sorry, brother, it just took that long to get it all out." So, I frequently offer my Coltrane apology. In 1912, Du Bois gave McGee credit for creating the Niagara movement at this memorial program, stating, "The honor of founding the Niagara movement belongs to F.L. McGee, who first suggested it." So there's a lot of history in this church, in this parish, in this congregation that we need to uphold and move forward, okay? McGee helped organize the Twin City Protection League, which eventually became the Twin City branch of the NAACP in 1911, and as I mentioned, Fred McGee died in 1912. The St. Paul branch of the NAACP, I like to call it the Capital City branch, was founded in 1913 in his honor, okay? When 17 members of the Twin City branch met at St. Philip's Episcopal Church, including Father Stephen Theobald, and including many of the members of this congregation. That same year, the St. Paul NAACP conducted its first successful protest march to City Hall, 1913, okay? The Minneapolis NAACP, I'm pleased to inform you, was formed later, after the establishment of the St. Paul chapter. A lot of people don't realize that Minneapolis is a suburb of St. Paul. One of McGee's biggest supporters was Stephen Theobald, who was born in 1874. He was a black journalist, a priest, a lawyer, and a community activist. He was born in British Guiana and educated at St. Stanislaus College, Queen's College, and graduated magna cum laude from Cambridge University in England, where he got his law degree, okay? Theobald was a columnist in Canada for the Montreal Star newspaper, where he was recruited by Archbishop John Ireland, the one who built the cathedral with James J. Hill's wife's pin money in her apron, okay? And Fred McGee. So John Ireland and Fred McGee went to Montreal, recruited Father Theobald, Stephen Theobald, converted him to Catholicism, and at the age of 31, he came back to St. Paul, enrolled in St. Paul's Seminary, kitty corner from St. Thomas University, and began a 5-year curriculum toward ordination. He began that in 1905. He was ordained June 8th, 1910. And Theobald would become the first African-American priest west of Chicago, west of the Mississippi, as I said earlier. Began as pastor of St. Peter Claver in September 1910, focused on the Rondo community, developing relationships and providing education for young people. He was in demand as a speaker locally and nationally, and his last recorded special sacramental celebration was a baptism on June 12, 1932. On the same date, a month later, Father Stephen Theobald passed away. Okay? The St. Paul NAACP existed because of Fred McGee and a lot of people within the St. Peter Claver congregation. I'm going to close my remarks now. And had its offices in the school building, in the church rectory for many years, held its meetings in this room, executive and general membership meetings for decades. And I want to talk about reparations just briefly, because that's on the lips of a lot of young people today who keep looking in the mailbox for a publisher's clearinghouse lottery check, okay, so they can go out and buy a new Cadillac and go to Las Vegas or something, okay? And let me just say this. Reparations does not lend itself to a one-size-fits-all solution. Seniors, single moms who get little or no help from their baby's daddies, renters, students, black men and women who are incarcerated or have felony convictions, people with cancer or who lack health care, period. And I want to commend Sister Estella and her group for working with families who have, extended family members who are incarcerated. Black men and women who are incarcerated or have felony convictions, people with cancer or who lack health care, period, blacks in different financial brackets. All of these people have different needs. There is no quick fix, magic bullet, silver bullet, one size fits all solution in terms of reparations. And we need to be real clear about that. Would you create a blood quantum for mixed race persons who are partially black? Or limit financial support for black people who have caused extreme harm in our community or who are wealthy by whatever definition you use? What about those who have been passing? Do they qualify? A lot of folks would come out of the woodwork, okay? Do we sign no fault or non-disclosure agreements if we accept reparations and promise not to seek any compensation for future psychological trauma that stems directly from 700 years of slavery, discrimination, and outright oppression in this country? What lessons do we take away from what happened with the individual stimulus checks? Did the baby's daddies buy clothes and diapers with their money? Did we give grandma money to repair her false teeth or catch up on back rent? Or did the stimulus money leave our community as fast as the guys who steal our catalytic converters in the middle of the night? All right? We need to study reparations, define reparations, and again, quit looking in the mailbox for them mysterious checks. A lot of people were looking in the mailbox for freedom, okay, and it didn't come. This issue is grossly and too insufficiently documented to debate. If you want to learn more about it, read Randall Robinson's book, The Debt, okay, D-E-B-T, The Debt, which is about what America owes black people. In closing, on Dr. Martin Luther King's birthday, I really am closing now. As we approach Black History Month, on the very land where Dred Scott was held and George Floyd was bound, remember, Derek Chauvin didn't get up, he didn't let up. Remember, we have much to mourn, remember, celebrate, and recall. Even as we celebrate our history, culture, and resilience, we find ourselves facing another threat of reconstruction where we can either move toward justice for all or back again toward privilege for an ever-shrinking few. Today, we issue a call, a moment, and an opportunity to recommit to the work on behalf of St. Peter Claver Parish and our Social Justice Committee, Work for All, and the eradication of anti-blackness, anti-anybody, as common practice, common sense, and a too common cause of death. Our history tells us where we've been, and inspired by our freedom and dreams we can bring to fruition together, where we still must go and what we still must be and do. Please join us to better our Black futures, our parish, and our community, so that we all may enjoy watermelon sunsets through truth-telling and a broader imagining of the categories of possibility that social justice and an accurate sharing of our history can, will, and should present us with. Dr. John Henrik Clarke stated that history is not only important in making the people whole again, but the role of history is about how a people use their talent, take pride in their own history, and love their own memories in order to fulfill themselves completely in all of their honorable endeavors. As Saunders Redding put it in The Negro Writer and His Roots, history is a clock that people use to tell their time of day. It is a compass which people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. The relationship between any people and their history is the same as the relationship between a child and its mother. History not only tells the people where they are and what they are, but more importantly, it tells the people where they still must go and what they still must be and do. Thank you very much.
Very good.